It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. Today, my guest is CEO Dar Vasseghi. Dar has enjoyed a prestigious career in specialty retail and food brands for more than 20 years. But he began his career flipping hamburgers at McDonald's at 16 and has worked for many of the largest food brands in the world since then, including Yum Brands, Dunkin Brands, Arby's, Jamba Juice, and Chobani. Dar became the CEO of Yoshinoya USA on August 13 and earlier graduated from the University of Southern California with a BS in Finance and Economics and later attained his MBA from Stanford. Dar Vasseghi, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you for having me, Brant.
Wonderful. Well, we kind of like to start with the early years, and I want to hear about that guitar tour. So we're definitely going to get to that at some point. But tell us a little bit about where you grew up and, what was your family life like?
So I was born in the Middle East, in Iran to be specific. And my family moved here in 1978 when I was 11 years old. This was the time of the revolution. And
that was when the Shah was deposed.
Exactly. And all that chaos. And so my family moved to a suburb of Los Angeles. And, a lot of families came here for education. They brought their kids here, but they all thought they would go back. With what happened with the revolution, we were sort of cut off. And, my family, who was never wealthy to begin with, we lost everything. And
pretty much had to leave it all behind, I imagine, right?
Absolutely. Well, yeah. So you kind of start fresh, and that is a life-changing experience. Were
your parents in their 30s or 40s? Were they kind of midlife at that stage, or had they already had pretty successful careers in Iran?
So I'm the youngest of 7 children. So my parents were already in their 40s and their 50s. And so it was a little late for them to adapt fully, and so they couldn't. Yeah, but the kids adapted, and we all went to work because that's
that's what you had to do.
That's
right?
What you did to survive.
What kind of business did your parents have when they were in Iran? Were they in professionals? Did they have their own business, entrepreneurial background?
So not really. My father was I would say a government employee. He was a mid-level bureaucrat. He worked in the customs department, and my mother was
busy with 7 kids. Oh, she was a teacher as well. Fantastic.
She was a teacher, and then she worked in the Department of Education, etc. So good values, if you will, but not a lot of help in terms of direction.
Well, how did they start over? Did they go into entrepreneurial business? Were they able to find, careers in their profession after coming over to the States?
So my mom started sewing and making draperies, and she started a business where she literally made curtains and draperies for people in the garage. And my father, who was approaching retirement age. By that point, he went to work as a warehouse supervisor for a friend of his. There was just they spoke very little English, and it was probably very tough to learn English at that age.
Of course, they had to do. And you were the youngest, you said, or the oldest of 7?
No, I was the youngest.
You're the youngest, right? So how the oldest sibling? How old were they, or how old was he or she when you arrived?
So the thing about being the youngest of 7 children is you don't really grow up with 6 siblings because there's such an age difference that
that's right.
They're in very he may as well, my oldest brother may as well have been my uncle. So we were
In
all,
many ways may have had that responsibility too, knowing kind of the
yeah,
Middle
and
Eastern culture. And
sure, and in some ways he did. Today he's around 70, and a very healthy, an active 70. So huge age difference. Um, but we're a close family. We stay in touch. We all sort of gravitated from various parts of the world, gravitated back to Southern California so we could be near each other. But we all started over again.
yeah, yeah, I guess you had to. And were your older siblings able to assimilate into school straight away? Was that kind of part of it, or were maybe some had to go to work right away, right? Given the age differences.
Sure, some of them who were older already had families. They started businesses, very successful businesses, also in the restaurant industry,
Is
which,
that right? Okay.
yeah, apparently that's your destiny as an immigrant.
Well, we all love Persian food, Jar. So that's not a hard thing to do. And I know of several very good Persian restaurants in Southern California. So maybe even some that are connected with your family.
Yeah, for my family, it was usually pizza and Italian
Okay.
food. But yeah, I mean, my brothers and sisters all did very well, and some are lawyers and some are engineers, and a couple of them owned restaurants that did very well.
So when you came over, you were 10 or 11, so middle school age or still in elementary school? Where did you kind of enter in?
So I started the sixth grade here.
Sixth grade, right? Got it. Good. So that was early enough to where you could kind of assimilate. And any language skills at all when you arrived
I studied English several years back
in Iran?
in Iran, and I thought I spoke English until I got here and realized I didn't speak English at all.
I'm sure. And given the slang and the dialect of Southern Californians, like, what did you just say?
Well, I mean, I still remember that the most complicated thing I could say when I got here was, "Where did you buy those shoes?"
Very important question for a
Yeah,
sixth
well,
grader.
and that I had just memorized.
I love it. Who or what were some of the early influences in your life? That assimilation process is difficult. And, you were young, but still, I'm sure it had its challenges.
In a situation where your parents are out of touch with your particular surroundings. My parents didn't speak the language; they didn't understand the culture. They brought in uncles and aunts who could be helpful, who had been here for
You had
decades.
family. Yeah. You had
Yeah,
family
we
that
had
had
a
been
lot of
here.
family here, and right or wrong, they were it. So and so you took the advice and the guidance where you could or where it made sense to you, and you did what you could with it. Once I went on to school, there's the occasional teacher, but that didn't really start for me until college. I
A
think
little later on. Yeah.
yeah. Once I got into college, I remember specifically, I had a finance professor named Maury Goudsworth at USC, and I latched onto him as a role model. I just thought he was a really cool cat, and I wanted to be him.
In those earlier years when the uncles and aunts were more the influencers, was there one or two in particular that you kind of loved, not only from a family standpoint, but kind of provided that mentoring and that guidance? And if so, what were the kinds of things they told you about American culture and what you needed to do to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, I had three uncles here who all chipped in with their time, some more than others, and they provided a variety of functions. And it wasn't, when you're that young, it's not as much advice as it is, just spending time with you, taking you around,
Right, right.
showing,
Speaking the language with you, practicing
exactly,
with you. Yeah,
exactly. So,
yeah.
I had a couple of uncles. I remember, he would pack all the kids because I had cousins here as
Of
well.
course.
So
Yeah, sure.
so we would pack seven people into a small BMW and drive up to Yosemite, and I think we made that trip six times. And you don't realize it at the time, but those are very formative
Yeah,
experiences.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic. Were you a good student in school, Dar, in those middle school and high school years?
I was a terrible student
You're not
because
the first CEO to say that.
yeah, no, well, I didn't speak the language. Back in Iran, I was a very good student.
Right, right.
But once I got here, the language problem I failed a lot of classes. I remember that I would sit in math class and science class, and what was being covered were things I had either learned years earlier or experimented with, you know, at home, but the language barrier was just too much. And so, all through middle school and high school, it was hit and miss. You also are a bit distracted by just trying to make sense of the world and trying to fit in. And doing well in school is just not your priority.
What about outside of class? Sports, music, theater, art, anything that you got engaged with during those earlier years?
So I always worked because, and I believed that everybody did. It wasn't until like I was in my 30s that I realized that not everybody worked in school and not everybody paid for their own college.
Well, you went to USC, so I mean, right?
Yes.
There had to be a few of your college roommates there that probably didn't work much when they went through school.
No, but yeah, I'm still paying back the loans, believe me.
I can imagine.
So I was always busy working. The only thing,
Restaurants and so forth, or what types of things? Yeah.
well, I mean, so when I was 16, I worked at McDonald's, and before that, when you're too young to work, I would mow lawns and pick, rake leaves in the neighborhood. For pocket money. But at some point around 15, I decided I wanted to be a rock star.
Ah, okay, got it. So now we get to talk about the guitar touring. So is that the first instrument you picked up?
My father was a musician, and he played a classic Persian instrument. But yes, for me, there was a piano at home, and nobody ever played it. But the guitar thing was more about, I saw it as a way to have a presence, to get on stage, to perform, to be liked, to be popular, to be in control, which was something that you struggle with a lot when your life has been sort of stopped and restarted.
You were an immigrant. You're an immigrant. Obviously, it's a lot of adjustment going on. So did you join a band? Was it something you did more individually?
I grew my hair, which I think freaked out my whole family for a while, and so I started playing guitar. I started hanging out with a different crowd, and joined a variety of bands, and I played heavy metal. This was the '80s, so I spent a lot of time on the Sunset Strip at the Roxy and Gazzari's and the Troubadour, and I played a variety of bands, and then eventually I heard Gary Moore and switched immediately to playing the blues. I played that for many years, played a little flamenco later, and now if I can squeeze out 15 minutes a week in the garage, I'll play a little.
So were these paid gigs?
I've played for as much as $2,000 for a gig, and I've played for as little as a pound of coffee.
Sometimes you needed the coffee more than the 2,000, I imagine. Well, that's great. So did you take some time off to do that, or was that always in conjunction with your studies, either in high school or college?
No, it was, studies, I'm not sure. There was a lot of studying going on, but no, I started, there was probably a brief moment, of about a year or two where I thought I could make a career of the music. But, you get on the Sunset Strip, you watch how many people there are out there playing as well or better than you, and it became very clear to me that was not going to be much of a living.
It's a different competitive field.
It's very competitive, but it's also, you can become a working musician and scrounge up a living, but becoming a rock star is very similar to becoming a professional athlete.
Or a CEO in that regard.
Yeah, it's probably a little easier. A little easier to be CEO than it is to be a rock star.
I don't know about that. So you went on to SC. What was kind of the determination for going there? I mean, it's obviously a good school. You had to have decent grades to be able to get in. But was its proximity? Was there, a course of study there that you were interested in? Or, did it just kind of fall into your lap, so to speak?
So it was certainly not decent grades. And I came out of high school, I want to say like 1.9 or 2.0 GPA. And I did not go immediately to college. I started a couple of different businesses, and I was doing the music thing.
So Dar, tell us about some of the other entrepreneurial activities you were involved with.
So When I graduated from high school, I did a couple different things. I started this company selling window shades door to door, and my mother was making curtains and draperies, so I thought this fit in very well. And that was very difficult, and it was not an easy way to make any money. I also
You learned a little bit about customer service, I imagine, though, right?
I did, and I learned I needed to have very thick skin, which I didn't at the time.
Right, right.
The other thing I did was when I turned 18, I got my real estate license and I became a realtor and I was selling homes. And so I think, in the year and a half that I did that, I must have sold, three or four homes. And that turned out to be a lot harder than it looked as well. So I think that was all, part of the process of me, saying at one point, maybe I should give this college thing a try.
And were those productive years when you were selling the shades and real estate and so forth? Was that kind of spending money, or were you already supporting yourself?
It was the years of, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to make a living? You got to remember at that point, I had only been in the country about 6 or 7 years. And so I was trying to piece it all together. And, my mom being an educator, my family always valued education a lot. And, she's saying, you got to go to college, you got to go to college. And I'm saying, no, no, mom, I can do this. I can do this. And at some point I realized, no, she's right. I need to do, I need a different plan here.
Was your dad a proponent for you going on to college as well?
My dad, yes, I mean, certainly, but, my dad didn't weigh in very heavily on these things. I think my dad only gave me career advice once in my life. When you went at work, it's important to be obedient. I'm pretty sure I've disappointed him.
uh, well, I guess it's always a balance, right? You've got to have a little bit of that obedience, but you also have to be able to direct and, take charge of things as you grow the corporate ladder, so to speak.
Yeah, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're just sort of naturally wired like an entrepreneur, it's difficult. It's difficult for you to be obedient. It's very difficult for me to be obedient. I'm incapable of taking direction if it's not what I believe in.
Yeah, not in line with where you want to go. Yeah, yeah. And so went to SC. Did you go straight on to Stanford out of SC? Was there some first job out of school before you went on for your master's?
No, I researched. I mean, I knew when I was first year at SC, I knew I wanted to be CEO of a mid-sized company. I decided
okay.
that, yeah. Well, so all of this was about how do I figure out a way to belong here in this new culture. So the rock star thing, didn't pan out.
All
So
right.
my new plan was if I become CEO, people will accept me, people will like me. I'll be an American. And so these things all, I think to some extent, stemmed out of insecurity as an immigrant. And I researched the schools, and of course I wanted to go to Harvard at that time, because I wanted to be sure, that I was going to
Had the
stack the deck.
credentials. Had the credentials.
Absolutely,
Right,
yeah.
right.
So ultimately, I realized that you're not going to get into Harvard without substantial work experience. So I went to work. It was a very difficult job market. I think it was around 1990. There was a recession. I couldn't get an interview. Um, and so, through some, again, relatives and some friends, they turned me on to this bus company here in LA. And, so of course, they made me controller of this bus company with no prior accounting experience, which, should have been a red flag. Uh, but, the company was in bankruptcy. And so nobody wanted that job. But, we worked, and really did everything that was necessary and possible, brought in investors, and we started to turn that thing around. And then I went off to business school.
How long did you stay in that job?
I think about close to 3 years.
Wow. And did you have people responsibility as well, or was it more of an individual contributor role?
Well, sure. As the first thing I did as a, controller, never having done any accounting before, is I hired an assistant controller.
Right. Good move.
And of course, there was, accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, all that stuff. So
What was it like managing people for the first time then?
I was completely inadequate. You know, you have no concept of how that relationship works. Here you are. I mean, I was 23, and you don't know, you don't have the confidence to not tell people what to do, and so you just don't know how that relationship works, and you're so self-conscious, and you're so insecure, and so you wish people would just do what they need to do so you wouldn't have to be in that position. So but these are necessary evils. It's all part of the learning process.
Looking at that 3-year period, what were some of the leadership lessons you learned?
Everybody I worked with was older than me.
Mm-hmm,
And so I was in charge, so I would tell people what to do, and they would tell me to go jump off a bridge. So I didn't have a solution to that problem, but at least I realized that there was a problem there.
Right.
And then you sort of build relationships, and everybody figures out how to move forward, and so that stopped there. I would say, the result of that and many, many other lessons is today I'm in charge here, and I don't ever tell anybody what to do. I make suggestions, I make recommendations, and I respect the talent and the effort and what everybody on my team brings to the table. And occasionally they tell me to go jump off a bridge, but more often they tell me I'm full of crap, or they disagree, or whatever. And I like that back and forth. And today I have the experience and the confidence to not take that personally, and it doesn't bother me. And I think my team has the right and probably an obligation to speak up when they need to.
So back to school, got into Stanford. Again, no easy task. Did your 2-year degree there, and then what was that first job coming out of Stanford?
Well, so there's an important lesson here I should probably mention. I probably several lessons. I originally wanted to go to Harvard, and so I applied for whatever reason. I applied to Harvard and to Stanford. Now, I didn't apply to any other schools. Lesson one, that's dumb. Have a backup plan, right? Now, I luckily got in, but I chose Stanford over Harvard because yes, but I chose Stanford because I was dating this girl here in LA, and I thought, oh my God, this is the one. And so I'm going to go to Stanford so I can fly back every other weekend, and we can be together.
Close enough, right?
And yeah, it's going to work out great. And that all did work out great until she broke up with me 2 months before I graduated.
Oh, goodness.
So I'm sure there's a lesson in there somewhere.
Well, Stanford's a very decent school. And what was your first job coming out of there?
So I actually took a job at what was then called AT&T Equipment, which then became Lucent and became Avaya, and originally was one of the I think it was called Western Bell many years ago. And I lasted in that job, I want to say 2 days.
Wasn't a good fit.
It was absolutely not a good fit. And I went up to Northern California, and I would walk through this building, and the dim lighting, the closed doors, the engineering culture, which, not all, certainly today, the engineering culture is very different in Silicon Valley. But back then, that wasn't me. I was looking for some life. I was looking for conversation. I was looking for a challenge, an adventure. It was just not a fit for me. And I think I was ready to jump out a window by the second day. I had already interviewed with, Taco Bell at the time, because, that was the only other thing I knew was the restaurant business. And
they were back in Southern California at that time, right? Or were they? Yeah. So it got you back near home.
So I called them back and I said, that offer, is it still good?
And they took you back.
And they took me back, and yes, and I was gone the next day.
That was the start of your fast food career. So did you move right into management again with that role? Were you more in an individual contributor position to start?
This was the time when Taco Bell was still owned by Pepsi, and it was doing this weird thing, which anybody with any experience in the restaurant business today can tell you is wrong, which is they were improving the bottom line by taking labor out of all levels. And so you had store managers who were running 4 and 5 stores, and they had demoted the operators, the people who really knew how to run stores, and they had gone out and hired college graduates as business managers to run 4 and 5 stores. And then they had what was district manager had now become a market manager, and they were running 20, 30, 40 stores. And that's just not doable. And so the business started to deteriorate. At the same time, the whole value menu, the 59, 79, 99 was doing the brand in. They were just backed into a corner, low quality and low price. At some point, there's no place to go. And so, that business was in turnaround mode. And, right around the time I was there, Pepsi decided to spin it off and eventually became Tricon.
That's right. I remember that. Yeah. So you kind of rose through the ranks there and obviously worked with a lot of different bosses. What were some of the best or worst lessons you've learned from bosses you had during that early part of your career?
So I didn't last at Taco Bell very long. I was there for maybe a couple of years. I was in an operations role, and I think there were two issues and why I was not a fit. One is that pure operations was too much execution and not enough strategy for me. I wanted to know how decisions were made. I didn't want to just be out there executing them. It wasn't enough for me. I wanted to understand sort of the business from all angles. And the other issue was that my entrepreneurial style was not a good fit for an organization of that size.
Big corporate culture.
Yeah, and the culture was sort of very sort of stuffy, and there was this thing they referred to as Pepsi pretty. I find those kinds of things annoying and insulting. People should be respected for who they are as individuals.
How did you, kind of adjust to, or maybe you haven't, so maybe I don't want to assume anything, but, you mentioned a couple of times the immigrant status and, wanting to kind of have to prove yourself, wanting to be accepted. Did you ever find a place in your career, either now or somewhere along the way, where that didn't matter as much? You felt more American and you felt like a part of rather than apart from?
At some point, it stopped becoming it stopped being about becoming an American. That, at some point, I just forgot that was the issue. Those were the drivers in the early years. But at some point, it became about how I was or was not a fit in this or that organization.
Yeah. And you were probably more sensitive to that than others, I imagine, right? Given your background history.
You become that because of the feedback you get, which is, you're not easy to work with.
You're very driven.
You're
not particularly obedient.
Yes, all of those things. And people would refer to me as you come across as too confident, and I knew better. I knew that that's not really what they meant, and I knew that that's not really what it was. And what it really was this sort of this sense of urgency on steroids. Yeah, I was driven far too much because I was trying to make up for something. I was trying to fix something. And that's not right. And I think I still remember very clearly the transformation. At some point, one of my entrepreneurial ventures was me and this friend and I went to Arizona and we started a spa company. And built a couple of units and, started to show some level of success. And, for a variety of reasons, he bought me out and I, wanted to go back to the restaurant business. And so, I still remember I sold my shares to him for $86,000. And that felt like all the money in the world.
Right.
So suddenly now I had arrived and I thought, but what it did for me was it gave me a couple of years of working on my own and time to reflect. And then I went to Jamba Juice and I remember Karen Kelly at Jamba Juice, and I said, you don't know me, but here's who I am. I'm coming to work there, and I will do whatever you need. And it was my first attempt at trying to be a good employee.
Were they still in their early days then? How old a company were they at that time?
So this was 2006. The company was, give or take 15, 20 years old. But, that the year I arrived, there was an IPO, and a year later or 2 years later, the company nearly went bankrupt, um, because this massive plan to build out a lot of stores. I think the company built 140 stores in 1 year after having built no more than 20 or 30 a year before that. And we ended up closing a lot of those stores. So there were a lot of lessons in there. But I spent, about 6 years or so at Jamba Juice, and I did very well. I rose up very quickly because I stopped focusing on my issues and myself and what I was trying to prove, and I started just trying to serve, just trying to be a good employee. And it was amazing to me how quickly people now see the value in you.
Responded to that. Yeah, interesting. Well, that's a good lead into my next question, which is kind of how has your leadership style evolved over time?
So, I think very three-dimensionally. I think I'm very strategic, but because of all of the jobs I've had, all the various companies I've worked for, and because I've done operations, finance, marketing, development, strategy, etc., and because I enjoy the work, I enjoy having sort of a hands-on approach. I've learned to in a very smooth way, to move horizontally between marketing, operations, finance. So when I have a conversation, I think about all of these functions at the same time. It's all one holistic business to me. But I've also developed the ability to go 50,000 foot level and then 30 seconds later dive down into minutia. And so I can move across this this plane or two planes, if you will, very comfortably. Today I can't see any other way to do business. I can't see not understanding, certainly in my current job, not understanding all of the functions or not being able to do detail as well as strategic, high level thinking.
That's a very good skill. A lot of people aren't able to do that, particularly being able to shift gears because you really are doing it on two planes, right? You're doing it both from an elevation standpoint and also on the horizontal plane, right? Across the various disciplines. Yeah, we spoke a little bit earlier about wanting to get to know what Yoshinoya is and who they are. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that brand and why you chose them in what you're doing there today.
So Yoshinoya is actually, I think, probably one of the first QSRs in the world. The company goes back 120 years in Japan. The first store was in the fish market in Tokyo, and they served this rice bowl with beef on top and this wonderful beef broth, and that's a staple in Japan today. The company has around 3,000 stores globally, and the company entered the U.S. market about 40 years ago, and they had the same model here that they had in Japan for the most part. And through various decisions that were made to evolve the brand, it got to a place where it sort of leveled off at 100 stores, all pretty much in Southern California. And it was struggling. The business had been struggling for many years, and the main issue there was that, as is the model with many Japanese companies, they often send a CEO from Japan for a tour of duty of, call it, 5 years. Well, imagine how long it takes to learn the language and learn the culture and learn the business environment, which is very different than Japan. And then you go back and another new person comes in and starts all over again. So, yeah. So hiring me was really the first time that Yoshinoya decided to hire someone local, hire a local CEO with local experience. And the business responded very well. We turned, after many years of declining sales and transactions, we are now in our 5th year of sales growth, and the past 4 years we've had same store sales growth ranging between 4 and 7%, and we've had thank you, and we've had transaction growth every year.
Tell us a little bit about company culture there. We've referred to it a little earlier in our conversation, but what are your thoughts on building a culture? It sounds like you probably had to do some transitions with them, right? Did you proceed or rather follow a Japanese CEO?
So I followed the Japanese CEO, and the culture that had been developed here was this weird hybrid between the Japanese culture, the Japanese style of doing business, which works very well in Japan, But when implemented here, it turns out to be something that nobody really recognizes. It was this very directive, sort of disempowering style, because the hierarchy and seniority are very important in the Japanese culture, and that works in Japan, because people at all levels understand that and know what that means and how to respond to it. But here, it led to a sense of entitlement. It's lack of initiative, lack of decision making, and so the business from a management standpoint was anemic at all levels. And so we made a variety of desperately needed changes in personnel at the senior level, and ultimately began to turn that culture around. And that culture is not something that changes easily, especially when you're trying to go from one extreme to the other. The culture that we have here today is, it's I would say it's very performance based, but not the typical kind of performance based where people are just sort of very myopic about hitting numbers and all that. It runs a bit like a small business. It runs a bit like a family business. We have, I hire very experienced people. I hire my management team is very experienced. They worked at a variety of brands, years of doing what they do.
Mostly out of QSR, I can imagine.
Mostly out of QSR or other parts of the restaurant segments of the restaurant business. But we are all a bit quirky, and and I think that's probably true of all companies. But I think in this company, you're not judged for showing it. And I think we have, I am very informal because all of those years that I worked for those, very stuffy companies, I hated it. And wanted to be myself. And so when I got here and I got to be CEO, that's the kind of culture I created. So, if I come into your office to chat with you and I start putting my foot on your desk, the first couple times you'll think it's disrespectful. The third time you're going to come into my office and you're going to put your feet on my desk. So eventually I'm gonna taint you. And I'm gonna
you're shifting the culture.
Infect you.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about people. I know we've got just a few minutes left, but what do you look for when you're making bets on the people you invest in, Dar?
It depends on the position. I look for, if it's a more senior position, then obviously you look for experience that's very relevant, because that's really what you're hiring at a senior level. If you're looking for a more junior level, then you're looking for drive and ambition and a variety of other things. And we use a lot of sort of testing methodologies to help us get to who this person is. But I would say the common thread that I've learned is critical is you've got to hire people who are a cultural fit, because it does not matter how good their skill set is. In the wrong culture, they will not perform.
So true. How do you interview and hire? Do you like panel interviews? Do you do one-on-ones? Do you prefer short or long interviews? What's your approach? And let's just take, for example, a direct report, right? This is someone that, is going to report directly to you.
So I have people on my team who are very good at my VP of HR is very good at what he does, and so he's one of the few people in the world I actually listen to sometimes.
He knows how to sort to your preferences.
Yeah, though he would tell you that that's not the case. But like everything else I do, my methods are a bit unorthodox. I like to watch someone being interviewed, and when I'm
you mean sitting in the room with someone else? Okay,
yes.
Interesting.
So a lot of time, which frustrates my team, because they look at me like, what are you talking about? What? And then and I'll jump in when I have questions, and I jump in a lot. But when I'm interviewing someone and I'm going through a list of questions, etc., I'm in my head, and that's not where I want to be. I want to be watching this person. I want to understand what's going on. I want to see the body language. I want to hear the tone of their voice, and then questions pop up. The one question that pops up a lot in when I interview and I ask over and over again is, why did you leave that job? And I get a story, and then 5 minutes later I come back and go, just tell me again, why did you leave that job? And I'm trying to get to the reality. There are people, just because someone interviews well doesn't mean they're going to do a good job, and vice versa. And so, for once, I'd like to have someone say, "Yeah, I got fired because I did a very poor job." I think I'd hire that person just because
he's honest or she's being humble. Yeah.
But nobody ever says that. Yet we all know it happens all the time. So I think I'd hire that person just for authenticity.
Oh, that's great. Well, Dar Vasseghi, you've been very, very generous with your time. We've got one last question for you that we like to ask all the CEOs. And, what kind of career and life advice would you give to someone who's got their eyes on their own corner office in the future?
So I think it depends on who you are. I think so. Let me explain this way. If you're somebody who's generally not worried about your future, things are going to work out fine. Yeah, you'll take a job because it looks like fun, and you'll do a so-so job because everything will be okay in the end. My suggestion to you is, take it a little more seriously. Look down the road. Think about where your current path is going to take you in 5 years, in 10 years, and maybe put a plan together that matches that vision. And if you don't have a vision, get one. That's critical. If you don't have a vision, get one. The vision may be and will be off, and that's okay. But at least it gets you moving in a direction. Now, the flip side, if you're the kind of person like I was,
at the age of 20, wanted to be a CEO.
Yeah, very intense and very worried, and you see these people in the interview process, sometimes, and they just
a little paranoid, maybe.
Yeah, chomping at the bits, a little paranoid. My advice to you is relax. It's gonna be okay.
It's gonna be okay. All right.
Because the worst thing that could happen is that you reach your goal and then look back and say, and I didn't get to live.
Dar, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you, Brant. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.